Okay, so I hope everyone can see my title slide there.
Yes.
So good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be here with you this morning. As Deirdre said, I'm wearing two hats today. So I'm obviously speaking to you at this point in my capacity as one of the 4 HEI reps to the Teaching Council, and I am also project leader in Trinity College Dublin for our Ubuntu project. I just took over the project leader role this year. It was previously Jennifer Liston, who's also with us here on screen today. So I just want to acknowledge Jennifer's work on that. So I suppose my input for this part of the session is just focusing on global citizenship education in the Ceim Standards. And on speaking to both Deirdre and Joanne a couple of days ago, I put it something like this. It's a little bit like Christmas for GCE, in that we've made it into the Super 7 core aspects, mandatory required aspect of the ITE Ceim Standards. So as you probably remember from the programs that we're currently all implementing, the last program that we have, it wasn't a core aspect of it, and it really is wonderful to see that recognition has been given to it as being a core aspect, in the same way that literacy, numeracy, inclusive education are all core aspects of the new Ceim Standards. So a little bit of background perhaps on how we got to this point and to where we currently are. So obviously the standards were published last October into November, and they are the result of numerous and extensive consultation with stakeholders, with policymakers, with government departments, recognition of global literature, a really extensive process to get us to the point that we're currently at. The current program we're at, we probably all remember that in 2011 there was a perceived crisis around literacy and numeracy. Now, it may have been a crisis and it may not have been a crisis, but initial teacher education was one of the points that was focused on to improve standards of literacy and numeracy in our education system, both at primary and post-primary. And it was seen as a priority at the time. And now we find ourselves that global citizenship education is also recognised as a priority action, both globally and nationally. And the inclusion of it in the standards recognises the absolute priority, that it is in terms of underpinning all aspects of, our education system. So for something to be considered a core or a mandatory piece in the Ceim Standards, if you look at the other 6 standards that are there as core aspects of it, you can see that they're presented in a way that they can be explicit, implicit, underpinning, overarching, surrounding other aspects of the programs. And I think that's a good way to think about GCE within the Ceim Standards. Within the standards, basically we've been given the opportunity now to explicitly identify it as providers, to include it in very many different ways. And I think this is one of the really nice pieces about it, is that there will be a flexibility to us as HEIs to identify bespoke projects or modules or aspects of modules, or we can explicitly identify modules on development education, global citizenship education, life chance education, and we don't have to follow a set menu per se on it. Now, it is important to say we don't actually have the pro forma from the Teaching Council just yet. It's not far away, but we're not there yet with it. And once we have the pro forma, that's like the roadmap that HEIs will follow to construct the program, the new program that follows the Ceim Standards. But what we can say is that the inclusion of global citizenship education within the actual standards means that it Obviously, it's mandatory, so it must be recognised. And secondly, that it offers us huge possibilities and huge potential. It's so good to be in a really positive position as we face into, writing new programmes for accreditation in our own institutions internally, and then obviously at a national level. It takes account of not only the national priorities in global education and global citizenship education, but it also takes account of global priorities in teacher education. So the role of teacher education in informing the development, the preparation, first and foremost, of student teachers as they embark on their teaching careers, but also in terms of the profession and the impact and dissemination possibilities of a module being seeded, a module or modules or aspects of modules being seeded at the ITE phase, continuing into the induction phase, and continuing into the lifelong learning phase of the teaching profession. Those are brilliant possibilities. And in a time where a lot of us have actually turned off the news, I know I for one have, I don't look at it very much to try and spare, the negativity. Actually having this now, as HEI providers, as we look ahead, is a really positive piece for us, and it's something that we should really look forward to. I don't want to present a total, Pollyanna thing of it. It will be challenging for providers, because any inclusion of any aspect into a program of initial teacher education requires resources, and it requires time, and it requires recognition of the importance of it, and it requires buy-in, I suppose, from, at local level within our schools of education, at local level perhaps within our school placement aspects, and then at institutional level, where we have to go for accreditation as well, there has to be an understanding at the institutional level in HEIs of the significance of this, and also of creative ways that we might integrate, implement global citizenship education into our programs, that we might seek alternative forms of evidence that we're meeting learning outcomes, alternative types of success criteria that will allow our students to be creative, but also that we can kind of join the dots and have a tapestry effect really with global citizenship education, in the same way as we do with literacy and numeracy and inclusive education and professional identity, which are also all core standards. So what I would say is, it's very important that we look at the 7 core aspects together. That's a good way probably of actually looking at it, and that we see, within that, where does the global citizenship education sit? So, as they say in these things, in no particular order. Okay, so inclusive education has been put in there at number 1, and obviously, that obviously is a priority overall. It's seen as a hugely overarching priority. Secondly, then, our global citizenship education standard comes in to include education for sustainable development, well-being, both personal and community, social justice, and interculturalism. And those are not exhaustive in their own right. Obviously, there's flexibility and potential and possibility within those to extend, at length and at greater levels. Very interestingly, there is a stipulation there that there should be demonstrable integration between inclusive education and global citizenship education, rooted in the principle of care for others. And I think the 2 probably most important words within that are demonstrable integration. So that's where we see, if I can use an Irish phrase, where it's fitte fuite, all right, lena chéile. So it's literally, it's like a tapestry where you have like a convergence and divergence, where those 2 come together. But also then after that, professional relationships working with parents, professional identity and agency, creative and reflective practice, literacy and numeracy, and digital skills, including digital literacy. So it's a bit like, when you ask your children to write their Santa list coming up to Christmas. Okay, so what's on your list? What would you like to have? At the outset of this process, there was, a similar type exercise in terms of, okay, if you could have anything you liked at all, and if anything could be included, what would you like to be included? And I'm really pleased to say that global citizenship education was one of the top priorities. And I know both Deirdre and Joanne would have been at that stage of it in terms of contribution by stakeholders. And there was huge positivity and agreement on it. I can also say that there were pieces that stakeholders articulated, and some of you here today were at that stage, and they haven't made it into the 7 core principles. Okay, they're probably maybe covered in a little way, but they're not explicitly identified. So in terms of the consultation, obviously the consultation also goes at government level, and both departments are very, very pleased that it is there, and obviously have been keen that it is recognised and prioritised as an aspect of our ITE programmes. So I think a good way of looking at it is if we look at those core aspects there as a totality, and if you were to be in a helicopter, perhaps looking down, you should, all things being equal, be able to, over time of a program, as a program runs on, pick out evidence of those 7 core aspects. And that might manifest in, many different ways as the programs progress. At sometimes it might be very explicit, and at other times it might be more implicit. It also may manifest in the values or cultures or beliefs that we communicate, as teacher educators, and that we try and embed and we try and instill in our student teachers. And also on the school placement aspect, Deirdre referred to the guidelines there for school placement and also for reflective practice. At the external piece of our teacher education, programs, that we might see evidence there manifesting within the teaching, within the learning, within the assessment, within the students, the pupils learning actually out in schools as well. So it's kind of like looking from, that helicopter view down, and that we should be able to, if we're to try and conceptualize at this point, because I know that's what people are going to try and do, how might this actually be, and, how might it actually look? So we're now at the stage where, although we don't yet have the pro forma, but we will have that soon, that we probably need to start looking at where we are actually heading with this. And I would say that it's never too early to start thinking about how this might actually look in your ITE program, given that we're assured and, there's a commitment now that it is there as a mandatory aspect of the program. So at IT level at the moment, we're all in a very challenging situation where we deliver our programs online. Our school placements have been disrupted. It's difficult to say the least. So it's really nice and it's really positive to have something to look forward to that will happen, within the next 2 years probably, and we can see it actually coming to fruition at that stage. So, and again, these are just my views in terms of perhaps what might GCE look like in your IT program following the Ceim Standards. And again, simply just suggestions and things to talk about, and obviously just to kind of get a bit of discussion going about it as well. So the first thing I suppose that we might think about is it might be integrated across a number of modules, okay, with identified explicit learning outcomes and clearly defined success criteria. So we can't just say, and certainly I think we all know the danger of saying even institutionally, okay, we need to include some global citizenship education in there. If we don't have identified learning outcomes for it and we don't identify the success criteria, there's a chance, or there's a danger perhaps, that it won't be meaningful and it won't actually be there. So that would be one thing if it's integrated. So integration is an option, but there still needs to be explicit learning outcomes, okay, to meet it with the success criteria. Obviously, the explicit development education modules, or GCE modules, that are explicit modules in their own right, of whatever number of credits that your institution can actually allocate to it, those will be very explicit, and they're probably the easier option in one way, but in another way you have to source and you have to have staff and you have to have resources to run them and to assess them. So just to think of that as well. Another way, and again, this is already happening through the Ubuntu network, integrating it into reflective practice. So all IT providers build reflective practice in as an integrated model, but also as an explicit model. And we all use different models of reflective practice. But essentially, what we are doing, we are enabling our students to think reflectively, to act reflectively, and to inform their own practice reflectively. So an aspect that we could actually think about doing is either including a specific GCE lens or prism or perspective within that, and maybe, you know, encouraging students to think about it from that perspective alongside other perspectives, or to build it in over time, all right, because there's quite an amount of school placement built into the new programme, so there's plenty of opportunity there as well. Within the school placement modules, all right, across the subjects, the range of subjects at post-primary that are offered, okay, that there would be specific learning outcomes identified within your school placement modules. So by their very nature, the school placement modules within the Ceim standards are big modules. There are significant credits attached to them, which in turn means that there's significant student effort required to achieve the learning outcomes in them. So again, a suggestion would be that there are very specific learning outcomes that identify GCE, and again, have the success criteria you know, there as well. And obviously building that incrementally over the lifetime of a program is important as well. So it's taking that helicopter view again and having the totality of the experience and the totality for the student teachers. And essentially what you're doing is you're embedding a culture within your students to think, all right, GCE, at the same time as they have to think of, you know, other pieces as well that are important. Another possibility, which wouldn't obviously offer explicit modules to everyone, but there might be elective modules. It might be possible if your ITE program has an elective option, okay? And I am very conscious as everybody here, that the 120 credits is packed as it is, so that may not be an option. But you know, never at a better point than at the very start of something to start looking for something or arguing for something, particularly when it's mandatory within the standards. Another option, and again, this is an option that's current as well, that worth thinking about, research options, okay? So that it would form, it would be prevalent in the research options that are made available to students, either in their theses, dissertations, small group projects, bigger group projects, and that thereafter there could be dissemination on, you know, the research projects in general, but that's where your GCE dissemination would come to the fore as well. And one final one, I suppose, that I think about is student-led dissemination, because as we all know, there's nothing better than giving the students the responsibility and ownership of, you know, projects and of concepts, and allowing them and enabling them and supporting them, you know, to disseminate themselves either. And again, these are just examples and suggestions. Dialogue days internally, publications. I know lots of HEIs have publications, have internal conferences where students present and record, and the dissemination you know, follows from that. Okay, so again and again, you'll forgive me if I refer back to something that's probably here a long time, but it's quite solid. In terms of how you might think and the arguments you might make at local level in terms of the introduction, you know, of this as a mandatory piece, Bloom's taxonomy is a very good way, all right, to think about how, all right, it's creating that scaffold for you as a provider to actually, you know, get your, construct the modules or the integrated pieces and use those as you go along. So from, you know, the top down, all right, with the PME students or the ITE undergrad students, and thereafter with their pupils, students that they have out in school, remembering, understanding, applying, analysing, evaluating and creating. Nice, safe scaffold and framework there that would be helpful perhaps in introducing your content you know, to your students and in embedding it into your programme. And finally, thinking from here, all right, what the next steps might be. And again, as I said to you, I'm obviously speaking in a capacity both as a project leader here today and someone who works in school placement and who works in ITE, and also from, you know, who also is on the teaching council, seeing all ends of this. The next steps, all right, and bearing in mind how busy everybody is at the moment, but this can start sooner rather than later. So the pro forma will issue from the Teaching Council, hopefully in the next short while. So again, suggestions might be start talking about it, all right? Start having the conversations about Ceim and GCE and Ceim within your own HEI. Talk to colleagues, talk to school placement tutors, talk to course directors, heads of schools. Start sowing the seeds, all right, of how this might come to fruition, okay? And get the ideas out there. Ask your current students, okay? So everyone here obviously there has an Ubuntu project, and can see that is working within their program. So ask your students, ask them what they think, all right, because they are current IT students and it's very relevant for them. Ask other stakeholders, ask the schools maybe that you work with, ask other people along the way. And really importantly, look at all the possibilities, okay, that you as a provider, taking into consideration your institutional obligations, your accreditation requirements at institutional level and thereafter. Look at any possibility that there is to include it, to embed it, and to integrate it into the fabric of the next IT programme, in the same way as we all took on board literacy and numeracy, in particular, reflective practice and becoming reflective practitioners last time round, either explicitly or implicitly, and most importantly, with defined learning outcomes and clearly identified success criteria. And I suppose my final message or suggestion around it would be think meaningful integration, inclusion and visibility for GCE in your IT programme. It's in the standards, it's there, we've gotten it at a point which is wonderful. It's really, really great for us to be there. Now, it is going to be over to us. I don't underestimate the challenges we'll have, but I think the opportunities will far outweigh the challenges with this within the new Ceim standards. So thank you for listening to me. I hope that was somewhat useful, and I'll stop sharing my screen there now. And Deirdre, I'll hand back to you.
Melanie, thank you ever so much for a really comprehensive overview. There was so much learning in the slides that you've done there, in the reflections that you've had in terms of the GCE standards there and global citizenship ed. It's super to get the perspective from inside, and there's so much that's actually struck me. Even though we had a conversation the other day, there's so many new aspects that have struck me. So I think you've given us the challenge that we can't really rest on our laurels saying we have global citizenship ed happening in our projects. Our challenge is now to see how it can be reflected across the 7 components, as you mentioned, in a really meaningful, purposeful, streamless way. So Melanie, thank you for putting that challenge out there, and also for the great ideas that you've put out there in terms of electives or reflective practice or school placement. There are so many different ways that we can now build this in. So it is like Christmas. I love it. It's fantastic. It's exciting. It's challenging, but we're exactly where we want to be. So thank you, Melanie. We have just a few minutes. So if there's 1 or 2 comments from the floor before we go into the teacher educators inputs, then I'd be delighted to have those. Gary, yeah, work away. So, yeah.
Thanks, Deirdre, and thanks, Melanie, very much for that presentation. And indeed, I'd thank you as a member of the Teaching Council. I think it's a really significant development, and I do think, Deirdre, without over-egging it, it is a great tribute to people, many of whom who are on the screen here today, but people who've been involved in Ubuntu and the organization of Ubuntu itself in foregrounding the importance of global citizenship. So I think you're both, Deirdre and Melanie, are quite right in acknowledging that it's a significant achievement, and one that I think we can all be proud of. There are 2 quite different points that I would just make in relation to the Ceim standards. One is the danger of false victories, as it were. As educationists, we need to be wary at the best of times of the fallacy of mandatory provision. making something mandatory on the curriculum is not historically a very successful strategy for curriculum development. So simply because it is mandatory, civics was mandatory in Irish second level schools for many years, but that didn't achieve, that didn't mean much more than lip service. So we do need to be careful, and I think we can be, but we do need to be careful not to simply assume that because it's mandatory, it is the job has been done. So I think that the challenges and the opportunities that Melanie has set out are absolutely valid. We need to ensure that we enrich the provision. I notice as well within the 7 mandatory elements, and I'm glad to see it. I think again it's a significant achievement. The identification of creativity as being a distinguishing characteristic that should apply to all teacher education programs. But again, there's a sort of almost a paradox there that we can't really mandate people to be creative. We have to be creative in how that plays out. So the challenges are as great as the opportunities, but I think we should welcome both, and I'd commend Melanie and our colleagues. And one last thing of a quite different nature is that I do think it raises for us in Ubuntu, when we talk about development education, we might yet again need to think about the terms we use ourselves. Is development education how we want to describe ourselves? Is global citizenship education a better term or not? I don't know, but I think that's something we might consider ourselves. But thanks very much. Thanks, Melanie.
Thanks, Gary, and great points. And you know, that conversation around what do we call it that we do, it's actually going to come up later on again. I think it's a conversation that keeps arising, Gary. So you're right. What is it that we do? Do we name it? Do we need to name it? Or what do we name it? So that those conversations will actually come up again further on in today. So thanks, Gary.
Deirdre,
yeah.
Deirdre, could I just really briefly respond to Gary's points, and I'm grateful that he's made them. You know, particularly the points around, you know, just because something is mandatory, you know, it's not always the right reason maybe to do something. But I suppose what I would say, and I think everybody here knows, if something is not stipulated within a pro forma or within a document, there's less chance of it actually being included. And it may be included in an ad hoc way, but you don't get an official commitment at institutional level. And all of us who work in ITE know how crowded, you know, the space is in terms of actually getting it. So having what I've suggested, I suppose, in terms of having specific learning outcomes peppered throughout, you know, wherever they can be, or within explicit modules, is the only way that at higher levels within HEIs that notice will be taken that it has to actually happen. So I completely agree in terms of, you know, civics is a very good example in actual fact. So, you know, just because you don't put something to be mandatory, you'd like to think in lots of ways that culturally and from a beliefs perspective and, you know, epistemologically even, that we could see that this is essential. If we might, but that's not to say that the powers that be will, and that's not to be critical of anyone in a senior management role. That's reality, and that comes down to budgets and FTEs and everything else, because money makes the world go round, as we know, and it makes ITE programs go round as well. So I take the point, and I think the point is well made, but we are in the driving seat. As it currently stands, it's really up to us, I suppose, and it just gives us a better point of argument, I suppose, at level. But I really think, you know, Gary, that point is very well made, and I think we should be thinking about that quite strongly. Actually, just making something mandatory, we shouldn't be mandatory for the sake of it. Okay, so thank you for that.
Okay, thanks, Melanie. Anybody else want to come in with a very brief point before we move onwards to the next session? Just if there's anything burning there that you'd like to mention or say.
Deirdre, yeah.
Yeah, hi, Aidan.
Yeah, I wonder, is there a further elaboration of global citizenship education rather than just that phrase there? Because I think maybe we might need to make explicit that inherent in that is the idea of a democratic culture, maybe, or democracy, you know, democratic action in the classroom, etc. You know, there's further other elaborations that might be needed to make it a more practical and useful.
Yeah. The definition given at the start of the Ceim Standards, Aidan, very much reflects goal 4.7 from the SDGs. So
Right.
it does include promoting a culture of peace, human rights, gender equality, sustainable lifestyles, cultural diversity, culture's contribution to sustainable development. So democracy isn't mentioned specifically, but I think it's...
Democracy has been nearly eliminated from international discourse to include all kind of governments and various other things, but just within the Irish context, a democratic culture is an important aspect, I think.
Yeah, okay, very good. Melanie, do you want to come back on that in any way?
Yeah, no, and no, absolutely. I think you've more or less answered, Deirdre, but it also goes back, it speaks to the point that Gary made also, I think, in terms of language and language and concept as well. So like one of the most obvious pieces in this is that we're now talking about Ceim Standards, and the use of the word standard in itself has very many different connotations for lots of people, and for IT providers and for people who work in schools and in education. Sometimes it can have a negative connotation, and sometimes it can have a positive connotation because it sets something up. The inclusion of democracy and the point Aidan is making is a very valid point. But I suppose what I would think maybe is, and again, this is my view, as opposed to anything, you know, specifically there, I would say when the programs are being written and when, you know, the modules are being designed or aspects of the modules are being designed, to explicitly name it. And name the democratic aspect of it, because, you know, we've suffered so badly in the last number of years, but particularly in the last 2 years, okay, with the erosion of a democratic viewpoint. It stands danger of being erased from the lexicon, even around GCE and around teacher education as well. So again, you know, it's just a suggestion, I would say, but again, I'd go back to the point, say we're in a good driving seat here, so name it and get it back in there, even if there's a danger that it's going to be erased at higher levels.
Okay. Melanie, thanks for that. Aidan, Joanne, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Just some updates from the chat as well, and just to let participants know that if we don't get the time to answer your question directly in this session, we'll return to it later on in the session as well. So there's some great positive comments coming in from members in terms of Melanie's input. Also some just comments in terms of Maria suggesting that it's really, in terms of the mandatory inclusion, the quality or authenticity of engagement depends on the wider buy-in across, you know, HEIs. Gertrude asks a brilliant question in terms of if it's included as a mandatory item in Ceim, are there additional resources provided to support and implement in terms of the ratios, etc.? So there's another very interesting comment. And Gertrude's also suggesting, in terms of just the last debate there, that the term political has been removed from the definition of development education in Irish Aid's current strategic plan as well. So that's just the update from chat.
Okay, thank you, Joanne. Super. Okay, folks, we'll move on to the next section, which is the teacher educators input. So these are from the projects that Ubuntu has funded throughout the year. So we